So I want to start bringing up some other isms that you've written about. And one of them is immigrationism, or as the French have popularized this. And so I'll get my kind of Poirot accent on immigrationism.
Tricolore.
Yeah. So what do the French mean when they talk about immigrationism or immigrationism?
Immigrationism, insofar as I understand it, it's a term that has been coined by the French. I think it was an anthropologist, Pierre-André, and I would also like to apologise for my French pronunciation, Tajueth. And it's basically that the idea of immigration is both inevitable and good. And from that stems an entire approach to immigration that governs basically most Western nations, because immigration is both inevitable and good. But the most important thing for people to do is break down barriers to immigration. And he writes very, very interestingly. It was, I've written about this on my Substack. I've written about it for the Critic, but if you really want to understand it, go and Google it, and it's in a copy of Le Figaro, I think, that is conveniently translatable into English. I'm not intelligent enough to read French, barely intelligent enough to read English. But basically, that is the idea that immigration is both good and inevitable has downstream effects that are very, very, very recognizable in almost any Western nation when we talk about immigration. So it becomes a process of intimidation because it is good and because it is inevitable. You have to break down barriers, and therefore you have to break down the people that are placing barriers in the way of further immigration. And that is when you get people accusing other people of racism when they talk about an opposition to immigration. I think that was particularly prevalent in Britain in the run up to 2016. I think after Brexit, we kind of broke the idea of talking about immigration being racist. I think that was kind of dismissed, and yet ironically, immigration has skyrocketed since then. But it's now from a more diverse set of places, so apparently that's okay. Which is absolutely not what people voted for, but that's by the by. So yeah, immigration is basically an enforcement mechanism for a group of people who believe that immigration is good and inevitable. And generally, they tend to be what Matt Goodwin might call new elites. So they are, intellectual elites. They will be financial elites. And I think a fundamental part of this is something I call neo-slavery, which is the idea that you will just constantly import a low-wage workforce forever in order to subsidize the living standards of a particularly middle-class elite, intellectual elite that actually cannot afford the lifestyle that they have. And I think one of the unintended consequences about Brexit going forward will be an increase in competition between immigrant groups, so that, we used to have a lot of EEA immigration, which was actually a net beneficiary to the Chancellor. We now have a lot of non-EEA immigration, which is a net drain on the Chancellor. But actually that allows for wage competition in the open market, as it were. So if you are, if you were previously pre-Brexit paying for your breakfast, let's say it's something woke like 2 smashed avocados and scrambled eggs and smoked salmon, right? If you have that pre-Brexit, and that's made by, let's say, a Spanish. We had quite a lot of Spanish people in services because the youth unemployment rate in Spain was so high. If it was previously made by people in Spain and now the immigration parameters are equalized, it's now made by somebody from, say, Indonesia, and it's made even cheaper, which allows basically the government to avoid the real consequences of immigration, because it is essentially a form of human quantitative easing, that you are absorbing cost increases through the importation of a lower wage workforce from abroad. And we will just continually find the lowest wage workforce.
Human quantitative easing. Now, there's a slogan, there's a saying that I can see become a bit of a slogan at some point in the future. One, no doubt, there ends up being an immigration reckoning. It certainly seems to be headed that way at some point in the future. Going back to your point about accusations of racism, when people call into question the policy of mass immigration, I read recently a book by Christopher Caldwell that preceded another book, which is probably more famous, The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. This book was Christopher Caldwell's The Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. And he was talking a lot about mass immigration within that book and what that meant culturally. And there was a quote in there which I think fits nicely to this idea of shaming people to questioning as to that policy. And the quote is this: "There are, however, great problems with shame as a means of governing. For one thing, opposition does not disappear, but only becomes unspeakable, making the public even less knowable to its rulers. For another, shame as a government weapon works only on people capable of feeling shame. It thus purges high-minded people from the opposition and ensures that when the now mysterious public does throw up an opposition, it will be led by shameless people and take a shameless form." I think what Caldwell's trying to get at here is you need to be able to have these conversations out in the open and not seek to shut them down, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a very ugly face shown in the end. And as far as I can see, that ugly face hasn't shown itself at the moment, which is good. I think those people who are questioning the policy, it seems to be on two separate grounds. There's the cost ground, which recently what's been quite interesting in European countries is, I think just before Christmas, the Dutch had run a study as to how much immigration cost and which groups and which immigrants cost them the most. And then just last month, the Austrians did it, and they were exorbitant figures, huge amounts of money. And then everyone was going, "Oh, Britain would never do that." But someone's gone and done it. I can't remember who it is, but something just came out in the last few days pre-recording this, which said that since 2020, immigration to Britain, or immigrants living in Britain that have arrived since that point, have cost the country £36 billion. 12 billion of that was spent on foreign students. So that's an awful lot of money. And considering we now couch things in economic terms when we discuss things in the political realm, I dare say that's going to become quite a talking point. And the other study which has been released that challenges that immigrationism policy is about culture. And usually that's off topic, but because now it's in the eyes of, this is being framed in the eyes of the immigrants themselves. So it's interviewing the immigrants. Why is it that you tend to choose somewhere like the United Kingdom? And the answers that have most commonly been given by people is because there are already large amounts of people like us there. It's really low effort to get there. Once we're there, we can feel comfortable. And so that throws into the light once more is, can you ever achieve a level of integration and social cohesion when that becomes one of the key motives? But interestingly, the findings of that study were people aren't necessarily coming just for the welfare state, even if it does seem to be true that Britain has created an international welfare state that's open to everyone.
Yeah. I think one of the things that this raises is that fundamentally you're right. I think when Tejieff wrote that piece, one of his points was that the ethics of conviction, especially if it is forced, is not policy. And I think that is increasingly becoming clear with our immigration policy. I think one of the interesting things at the minute is that we have a degree of outridership, and it's a degree of outridership with people who are saying that multiculturalism has failed. And, I think Suella Braverman was actually one of the first people to say this. She made what she called a civic argument, which was that, multiculturalism's problem is that it makes no demands of the incomer to integrate. It has failed because it allows people to come to our society and live parallel lives in it. And that essentially allows people to be in the society, but not of the society. And I think, I think that's really, really interesting, because I think that was the first time for a long time that we have had a frontline politician who was prepared to tackle uncontrolled immigration, inadequate integration, and, the misguided dogma of multiculturalism. I think that the fact that we have some conservative frontline politicians prepared to say that shows that there is a growing movement of people who are prepared to make these arguments, and I think that's more reflective of society, frankly. Because the fact is that you can't meaningfully integrate people when you are, in the last 2 years, we've allowed a city the size of Birmingham into Britain. You cannot come up with meaningful policy integration for that number of people. It's just not possible. It's just not possible. And what that means is that what we have essentially had to do as a society in order to enable a level of immigration that is this high is to water down what it means to be British and what it means to fit into British society. And one of the key tenets of multiculturalism is that essentially there is no monoculture, and that there is no first or foremost culture within Britain, including British culture. I think basically that when we allowed when we started becoming an immigrant, a country that allowed mass immigration, what we did was, David Goodhart describes this. What we did in order to allow that was we replaced the glue of ethnicity, which is a very, very kind of visible glue, on the basis of race. We replaced that with the glue of values. And so that made it relatively easy to accept Commonwealth immigrants, because we would, we got immigrants from India who were relatively culturally conservative. We got people from the West Indies, also very culturally conservative, familiar with like British forms of governance, familiar with British legal systems. And then as we expanded our remit of all the sources of immigration out, we gradually dissolved those, we dissolved that glue of values to the point where we can no longer really ask or make any demands of newcomers, and we can't even really ask them what their beliefs are. Which I think is a real problem for social cohesion going forward. And I think you do see that with, I do think you see that with a lot of the protests around Gaza, and I'm quite worried about that, what that holds for the future.